Hi, this is the Adventist Watchman. In our previous video, we created a little horn checklist from Daniel chapter 8. Now, what you must understand is that this checklist, we need to go through this checklist now in order to preserve the integrity of it. And so we're going to look at some of the points on the checklist. All right. So in today's video, we're going to answer the question. We're going to look at just number one on the checklist, and that is, does the little horn come from one of the horns, or does it come from one of the winds? Are you ready? Let's go. Now, as we begin this study, let's open up our Bibles to Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to look at verses number 8 and 9, the first part of 9. And here is what this text says in the King James Version. It says, "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven, and out of one of them came forth a little horn." Now, evangelicals and Catholics hold the position that the little horn came out of one of the other horns. And Adventists hold the position that the little horn came out of one of the winds. So what does this mean? Evangelicals and Catholics, what they're saying is that the little horn, as Antiochus Epiphanes, when it came up out of the other horn, that means, according to them, that this is Antiochus coming out of Syria, okay? And as Adventists, what we're saying is that the little horn came out of one of the winds of strife as the Roman Empire. Okay. Now, while a case could be made for either scenario, we recognize that only one of these can be correct. Now, if the evangelicals and the Catholics, if they can prove that the little horn came out of one of the other horns, then this would really nullify the position that Adventists hold that the little horn is the Roman Empire, because if the little horn came out of another horn of the Greek Empire, this would mean that the little horn came out of Greece. And as most of you should know, Rome did not arise out of Greece. Now, on the other hand, if Adventists can prove that the little horn rose up out of one of the winds, this would also nullify the Antiochus Epiphanes position. Why? Because we understand that the winds represent strife, and Antiochus did not come from one of the winds of strife, as we know that occurred in the divided Greek Empire. So we know that there is a lot at stake here, okay? So the first thing we're going to do to get into the study is we're going to start from the most basic of questions. And that is answering the question, what do horns represent in Bible prophecy? Now, in my video titled Horns, Heads, and Beasts, I reveal that horns typically represent kings, and I still hold true to that today. However, at its core, horns represents power. Now, this is not something that I'm pulling from just out of my head. We understand that Strong's definition supports the idea that a horn in Bible prophecy represents power. Now, let's talk about the sovereignty of a horn. When we look at Daniel chapter 8 and we look at each horn that is represented there, what you will find out is that every time you see a horn, it represents a new sovereign power. Okay? Now, let me prove that from scripture to you. Notice what verse 20 in chapter 8 says. It says, "The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Now, although the ram represented one power, we understand that it was two sovereign powers that were working together as one power. So we recognize that it was the Medes as a sovereign kingdom and the Persians as a sovereign kingdom. Now, later on, we understand that the Persians would basically conquer the Medes, but originally we're looking at two sovereign powers. So we recognize that both horns on the ram represent two sovereign powers. Now, in verse 21, we see another power rise up. It says, "And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king." Again, we see a horn being introduced, but when this horn is introduced, it's a brand new sovereign power. Notice what verse number 22 says. It says, "Now that being broken," referring to the horn of Alexander the Great, "whereas four horns," or four powers, "stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation." So now we see, after the death of Alexander, we see that the Greek Empire divided into four main sections, okay? And these sections are personified as four horns. But once again, we understand that even though they are seen as rising up within the territory of Greece, they are really four new sovereign powers. Every time we see a horn in Daniel chapter 8, it always represents a new sovereign power. Okay, so the structure of Daniel 8 determines that every time a horn arises, it's a brand new sovereign power. Now, the question is, when we see the little horn rise up, are we to break that structure and say that this little horn is not a new sovereign power as all the other horns, or are we to go with the current structure and interpret this prophecy, interpret this little horn, that it's also a brand new sovereign power? Ladies and gentlemen, whether you agree or disagree, what I'm telling you is that the structure of Daniel 8 determines that the little horn must be a new sovereign power. Another idea that is held by evangelicals and Catholics is the idea that horns come out of horns. Okay, if them in Daniel 8 and verse number 9 represents another horn, now you have a situation where one horn is birthing or producing another horn. Like a human cell split into two, they believe that one of the Greek horns divided into two. And now you have Antiochus existing independent of the nation that he rules. Okay, now I don't want to say this is impossible, but typically when a king goes to war to a foreign country, the king is represented as the kingdom that he is ruling. Okay, let me give you an example. Let's just say the president of the United States decides that he or she in the future wants to wage war against Iran, right? Well, what we must understand is that when the U.S. president goes to wage war, the president is not going by his or herself. They are taking the U.S. military with them in order to, wage this war. And in this manner, we must understand that the U.S. president isn't operating independent of the U.S. The United States president is the U.S. Now, when we look at the other components of Daniel chapter 8, we got the ram with two horns and we got the goat with the notable horn, right? We notice that when each of these symbols went to conquer, we see no evidence that the horns divided. We don't see evidence that even the horn came out of or came away from the beast that it was connected to, okay? And so when Antiochus came forth out of one of them, we can't separate Antiochus from his kingdom, because essentially Antiochus is the kingdom. And this is one of the main problems that I have with this two horns for one territory theory. Now, I want to make sure that I don't try to ridicule my brothers and sisters in the evangelical faith, because this is what they truly believe. And I don't really want to offend anyone in this video. My videos are not really meant to shock you or to offend. I know some of the opponents of Adventism, they come across as sarcastic and different things, but that's really not how I want to present my channel. Okay, I want to present my channel as professional as I can, and I want to be as understanding and kind and loving to my brothers in whatever persuasion you come from. Okay, so I understand if you are Catholic or evangelical and you're watching this, please understand that this video is not meant to offend you. Okay, but I must say that To me, in my opinion, this is a strange understanding or strange way of interpreting Daniel chapter 8. Now, let's look at the winds. What does the winds represent in Bible prophecy? Okay. Let's look at Daniel 7, 2 through 3. Notice what it says. It says, Daniel spake and said, I saw my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. The four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. Now, if you can kind of read between the lines, we should be able to see that the winds here, the reason why the beasts were able to come from the sea is because the winds represented strife and war and bloodshed, okay? Notice how Revelation chapter 7 and verse 1 kind of furthers this narrative. It says, and after these things, I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth. The wind, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on the trees. Hopefully we can see that the winds blowing represented a form of strife, most likely persecution, but essentially it's confusion. It's war, it's bloodshed, it's strife, it's confusion, okay? This is essentially what the winds in this context means here, okay? Now, the question that we must answer, is it possible that the little horn could arise from one of the winds? Okay. Now, let's answer this by looking at a few other texts in the Bible that refer to winds. The first thing we have to answer, or the first thing I want to present, is the winds of strife can consume people. So the winds can contain people within them, okay? And we see an example of this in Jeremiah 22:22, where it says, the wind shall eat up all thy pastors, and thy lover shall go into captivity. Surely then shalt thou be ashamed and confounded for all thy wickedness, okay? So here we can see that the winds can consume people, and I'm making the case, the argument that people can be inside of wind because it furthers the narrative that you can come out of the wind. Does that make sense? Okay, let's look at another chapter and verse, Jeremiah 49:32. Okay, and we're going to show you that nations can also be contained within the winds, or they can be sent to winds, and their camels shall be a booty, and the multitude of their cattle a spoil. And I will scatter into all winds them that are in the utmost corners, and I will bring their calamity from all sides thereof, saith the Lord. Okay, so here we can clearly see that nations can be consumed, or they can be contained in that wind, or sent to that wind. And if nations can be sent in the wind, then nations can come out of the wind, okay? And we see this clearly at the coming of Christ. Notice what Mark chapter 13, verse number 27 says. It says, and there shall he send his angels, and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. So here we can see that people, nations, and systems can come out of the winds of strife. Also, I want you to take notice that where the winds were situated from in Daniel chapter 8. Notice what it says. It says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones, talking about horns, and notice where they were, towards the four winds of heaven. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to be thinking here, if the four horns can be scattered towards the four winds, why is it beyond the pale that another horn can't also come from one of those winds? Ladies and gentlemen, if the winds represents the strife that was occurring throughout the Greek Empire, and we can see that, and if we determine that a new power was rising up, wouldn't we logically say that if that new power wanted to conquer Greece, it would have to enter through one of the wars or one of the strifes that were happening in one of the four corners of the Greek Empire? Now, here we must also make sure that we understand the little horn here cannot be the papacy. And the reason why it can't be the papacy, number one, the papacy did not come out of the winds of strife. Okay, we understand that in prophecy, we understand that the little horn, as the papacy, came up gradually and came up subtly. Okay, so we know that it can't be the papacy from that standpoint. Now the question is, did the little horn as the papacy, did it rise up out of one of the horns? Okay, and also we understand that the papacy did not come from Greece. So that totally disqualifies the papacy from even being the little horn in this particular verse here, okay? However, if we look at the Roman Empire, we should understand that Rome in the 3rd century BC began to war against the Macedonian Empire. And the Macedonian Empire was in the west of the divided Greek Empire. So now we can see that Rome entered the Greek Empire through one of the winds of strife, and that wind was in the western hemisphere of the Greek, or the divided Greek Empire. Okay, so we know that Rome did enter the Greek Empire, and it did enter through one of the winds, and so we can say that Rome came out of one of those winds of strifes that was happening throughout the divided Greek Empire. Now, last but not least, let's look at Islam. There have been some developments where some people are declaring that the little horn represents Islam, okay? And I want to look a little bit further into this. Islam rose around, depending on what source that you read, but from the source that I've read, it rose up as a conquering terror, or a conquering nation. I guess we can call that a conquering nation around 632 AD. Okay, Islam arose from Mecca and Medina around the Arabian Peninsula, which today would be like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen, those type of places. Okay, the problem here is that people that hold to this belief and say that Islam came out of one of the horns, we have to recognize that would mean that Islam came out of one of the divided Greek territories, okay? And we know for a fact that by the time Islam rose up, Greece was long gone. So we recognize that if adherents or people that agree with Islam believe that Islam is a little horn, say that it came out of one of the horns, this cannot be logically and prophetically true, because Islam did not come from Greece. Now, if we say that Islam came from one of the wars of strife that were happening around the divided Greek Empire, a small case can be made that this may be true, but even this is a stretch. And the problem is that when Islam arose, the wars that were happening around the divided Greek Empire, remember that part of the world was destabilized because all these kings were trying to conquer each other's nation. Okay, so by the time Islam came around, Greece wasn't a destabilized, divided Greek Empire anymore. As a matter of fact, the Byzantines were ruling that area, or maybe some of the other factions that were coming from the east. I'm not quite sure around that time, but we understand that this was not one of those winds that was described earlier in Daniel chapter 8. So even that's a stretch. So let's conclude what we have here. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe out of all the scenarios that I gave you, I believe the scenario that fits most logically and prophetically accurate is the idea that a horn, the horn of the Imperial Roman Empire, came up out of one of the winds of strife in the divided Greek Empire. Because remember, during that time, the Greek Empire was really it wasn't stable. It was destabilized because of all the kings trying to conquer each other, okay, and all the wars that were happening in those regions, okay. So I believe most logically, a horn came out of one of the winds of strife, the Imperial Roman Empire. It came out of one of those winds in order to conquer the divided Greek Empire, okay. So I believe that this is the most logical, and for that reason, I'm going to put a green check mark next to or in the column of Imperial Rome. Now, regarding the Antiochus Epiphanes view, a horn coming out of another horn, I'm not going to totally write that one off just yet. Even though I believe it is unlikely, I want to let this one sort of play out, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a gray check mark in this column. And we're going to continue to go down this pathway that the evangelicals and Catholics believe that a horn came out of another horn. And let's continue to see where we are with Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, regarding Islam, I am not going to, I believe that either view, whether the horn came out of one of the horns or one of the winds, I believe that either view cannot be supported, that the little horn is Islam, at least in this particular verse here. Okay. And obviously the papacy, I'm going to disqualify it as well, so it doesn't get a check mark, just as Islam doesn't get a check mark. All right. Now, this study is far from over, because we're going to continue to tinker with this checklist that we have, and we want to make sure that we understand exactly what is it that the checklist is saying. Okay. So from my view, I believe the checklist is saying, or Daniel chapter 8 is saying, that the little horn came out of one of the winds of strife. And if we believe that it came out of one of the winds of strife, we would have to believe, or have to say, that the little horn at this point represents the Imperial Roman Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, this study is far from being over. And in the comments, I would love to hear what you believe this little horn arose from, and why you believe it arose from there. And for those of you who hold to that the little horn came out of one of the horns, I want you in the comments to tell me, why do you think I'm wrong? In our next study, we're going to examine, how did the little horn wax exceedingly great, and which one of this list, would most likely fit this scenario of waxing exceedingly great. But for now, we're going to sign off. I'm the Adventist Watchman, and now you understand that the little horn arose from one of the winds of strife, not from one of the horns of the Greek Empire. God bless.